everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I just want to remind you all that we are recording. This will be posted to Facebook and YouTube. Tonight, we are discussing food insecurity. So thank you again for joining us. One of the reasons why we decided to focus on food insecurity for this fireside is because of the summer coming up. As many of you know, June is the month where many students come out from school and they lose access to school lunches. Families with children are 1.5 times more likely to experience food insecurity. And this was before COVID. Even though we're coming out of the pandemic now, food insecurity is still very high and it affects 1 in 4 families. Currently, there are about 13 million children without food in the US. That's 1 out of 6 children. And this becomes a problem, especially during the summer when they lose access to school lunches. So tonight we have 2 speakers with us. That's Kyra Jones from the YMCA of Central Ohio. Kyra is the Director of Health and Nutrition Shelter Services at YMCA. And we also have Ben Roach, who manages the homeless liaison at Hearth Project. I'm going to give each of them a bit of time to speak about themselves and talk a little bit about their work, and then we'll open up for questions in a panel discussion. Kyra, do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Sure. So first off, thanks for having me. I am Kyra Jones, and I'm the Director of Health and Nutrition in our shelter services arm of the YMCA of Central Ohio. In Columbus, where we are located, we operate 2 facilities, 2 homeless shelters, and we serve 3 completely different populations, right? So we serve single men, single women, as well as families. And families for us means any kind of configuration, as long as there is a child under the age of 18 and someone in that group has custody of that child. So we operate these shelters. It's for the last 18 months since COVID. We've operated year round, where folks get all of their basic needs met at shelter, along with case management, employment resources. We have a lot of community partners that we are introducing back into the shelter to participate in things like meal service. So we invite the community in to help us prepare meals, help us serve meals. We have folks sponsoring meals all the time in our shelter. And to give you a kind of an idea around how many people we serve about 12,000 meals a month. And so on any given night, we are sleeping a little close to 500 to 600 people across 2 facilities. So the work in Central Ohio seems to be never ending. We are experiencing, housing issues just like the rest of the country. And we are adapting due to COVID and the vaccine and all those things that contribute to that. So thanks for having me tonight. And I welcome any questions folks may have.
Thank you, Kyra. Our next speaker is Ben. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please just feel free to type them into the chat box. Ben manages the homeless liaison at the Hearth Project. And Ben, could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Absolutely. So I've worked with families with children in homeless situations for 11 years now. I was in charge of a family shelter, and for about 5.5 years, and I've been with the Polk County Public Schools and Florida homeless education program for the past 6. And I've been the homeless liaison, which is essentially the director of that program for about 2.5 years now. But it is federal law that there's a homeless liaison or McKinney-Vento liaison in every school district, public school district in our country. If it's a larger district, you tend to have a whole homeless education program. And so we identify, between 3,000 and 4,000 students experiencing homelessness every school year. So I have myself and a team of 4 other people that work to assist the students we identify experiencing homelessness and help meet their needs. But primarily, what our focus is making sure our district is in compliance with the federal law, but more importantly, making sure our kids who are in these situations are getting the supports they need to be promoted every school year and then eventually graduate, because we see these students graduating as the best chance they have at, their education is the best chance they have at ending that cycle that they're caught up in. And I can tell you firsthand, when I was in charge of the family shelter, that some of the parents had the most difficult times helping were those who didn't have their high school education, didn't graduate. It just made it very tough. So, but the McKinney-Vento Act has been around since 1987. There's 2 huge components of this law. The first one is removing barriers to education for students experiencing homelessness. A lot of school districts have all kinds of requirements for kids to even be enrolled in school. These requirements oftentimes create several barriers for students who are experiencing homelessness. Per the law, they're allowed to be enrolled and fully participating, even if they don't have certain documents for enrollment. So removing that barrier, number one, is key. And then the other part, a big part of that law is school stability. There was a study done that, it was with military families actually, and it showed that every time a student changes schools during the school year, they fall behind 4 to 6 months. And I had a student a couple of years ago, they moved 8 times in the first 2.5 months of school. 7 of the 8 addresses were zoned for different schools. So if the law had not been passed and was not around, that student would have had to change schools 7 times in the first 2.5 months of school. There's no chance a student in that situation is going to succeed. So we help facilitate students remaining at that school of origin, even if they've moved out of zone, creating that school stability, because for a lot of these kids, their school is the most stable part of their life right now. And they get the 2 meals a day, and they have that contact and have built relationships with staff at the school. So those are 2 huge components of the law that we help with. And of course, school readiness, making sure our students experiencing homelessness have, uniform, school supplies, hygiene items. We work to connect them with healthcare resources. I've written into the grant every couple of years, or for the past couple of years, funds so that we can connect them with a local health agency that has locations all throughout our county, so that we can make sure that they're getting their physicals and any other type of well visits. If they need glasses, if they need dental work, these are things that could keep kids out of school. So we're working to, prevent absences as well, utilizing that. But when it comes to the food, we do our part, although we are a homeless education program, and there's a lot of needs that our students have that we don't directly assist with. We do our best to be as eclectic as we can when it comes to meeting the needs. So whether that be forming relationships with agencies that can help with things we can't help with, so that we can connect our families to those resources, but also we get donated funds, and we're able to be more flexible with how we use them. So we received $10,000 worth of grocery store gift cards for public supermarkets that we're able to give our families throughout the school year. I work very closely with our director of school nutrition, and they've just done a phenomenal job the past 2 years creating, basically, I worked with them, collaborated with them to basically let them know, where do we have pockets of families that are staying, whether it be budget motels, whether it be some of the known areas where there's camps, but basically targeting these areas so that they could bring meals during the summer. So there are parts of our county that have a high population or a high concentration of budget motels where a lot of our families are. So the district during the summer will bring bring meals to those areas for families. I'm also on a committee partnering with United Way of Central Florida, George Jenkins' initiative to end hunger, which partners with Feeding Tampa Bay. And so we really looked at the food deserts in our county and strategically found agencies, whether it be a nonprofit or even a church that has the capacity to be a mobile food pantry. And basically anywhere in these food deserts that we could find a partner that would be willing to become or participate, so that they could whether not actually have a food pantry or at least be a site where they could do the mobile food pantry. So there's a lot of things, we're making progress, but unfortunately, as we all know, there's those that we miss. There's those that fall through the cracks. So I think the best thing we can do is just continue to, do our research. And, we serve Polk County, and, I know Kyra up in Ohio is trying to do what she can for her community. So it's certainly a team effort. But when you mentioned some of Tiff, you mentioned some of the statistics that are quite alarming early on. And so we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much, Ben, for telling us a little bit about your work. Our last panel speaker today is Derek Polka. He is the Policy and Research Manager at LA Food Bank.
Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Polka, the Policy and Research Manager for LA Regional Food Bank. We serve all of LA County, so quite a large service area. We've been, of course, like many other organizations, inundated with an increase in demand in general. But in particular here in LA County, we've seen elevated rates of food insecurity for families with children. It was already an issue, of course, as many of you know, well before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, it really skyrocketed. So we, of course, have always had school nutrition and child nutrition programs to try to meet that need. But this past year, with the challenges of school closures, we've really had to think of new ways of addressing the gap. So here in LA, we were lucky, and I'm sure many other partners on the call here can state on how wonderful the waivers have been in terms of, we run the summer food service program. We have been able to run it all year thanks to the waivers from the USDA, and we've seen a good amount of participation. We've also still ran our backpack program, serving over 36,000 backpacks in 2020 at 10 different schools. And of course, here in LA, we had LAUSD as a wonderful partner who was running the grab and go meal sites, which were also allowed thanks to the waivers. So those are our direct approaches. I think we recognize, though, that as a food bank, we can't, address the issue of hunger, and in particular childhood hunger, alone. So my role in particular focuses on policies that can address the gap and try to just make permanent changes to address the issues. So I was actually just on a call for a state bill, SB 464. It's an ambitious bill. Here in California, we have the SNAP program as CalFresh. And it would allow for any individual or household or family to apply for CalFresh regardless of immigration status. And of course, here in Los Angeles, we are a county of immigrants, a city of immigrants. So it's a very important step in trying to address hunger in the immigrant community. In addition, I'm sure some of you, or maybe all of you, have heard we just got a win in one of our legislative advocacy battles, in that we, in our state budget, were able to get universal school meals, which is amazing and huge. And it's thanks to the work of many people here in California and just throughout the nation who are still pushing for it federally, as we are as well. HR 3115, the Universal School Meals Bill, would help bring that about nationwide. So of course, our organization, along with our state partners and our nationwide partner, Feeding America, are advocating federally for that. So yeah, it's a very important time. There's some ambitious work being done, thankfully, in recognition, in foresight after, the year we've been through, that we weren't doing enough before, and now's the time to step up and start doing more. So yeah, I'd say we're moving forward. I'll also mention that here in California, we were lucky to have the PEBT program, pandemic EBT, which all states were approved, but I know some states haven't rolled it out yet. Here, we're hoping to see, again, nationally, a summer EBT program rolled out permanently. Here in California, we have a summer EBT as a pilot program. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you offer summer meal sites, the SFSP program. So HR 783 is the final bill. We work on a lot of bills, but those are the main bills I'll talk about in this brief moment, in that would offer the opportunity to provide school or summer meals without the bureaucratic barriers that are in place currently that have been reduced thanks to the waivers, again, because of the pandemic. So that's kind of just a brief overview. Of course, we work with over 700 partners in LA County who all serve a variety of people, in particular families. So that is the other main way we directly are trying to address hunger, is just through the support of our very just wonderful coalition of partners here in LA County. So I think I'll end there, and of course, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Derek. I just wanted to bring all the panelists back up, and this way we can kind of have a discussion. If you have any questions, please just post that in the chat as well. So Kyra, Ben, and Derek, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's a huge problem in the US, child hunger and hunger just in general. One of the things that I've noticed, however, is that it doesn't get as much attention as international hunger. The US is a more developed country, and I think that probably plays a little bit into that. I'm curious to know how we can draw more attention to this problem, specifically in the local communities that you all serve.
So I'll take a crack at it. I think the participation and advocacy from groups that come in and like really assist our populations. So in Central Ohio, we have Count. They come in all the time. They're faithful volunteers, and they speak our name in the community, right? And so I think that really brings some spotlight to what's going on. I think it's also I've taken on for myself to get out and speak to others about what we're experiencing. So during the pandemic, they announced all the waivers, right, that Derek was talking about how kids could get meals even though they weren't in schools. But what do you do for homeless kids who don't have access to a refrigerator, right? Because you might be getting a refrigerated meal or you're getting milk, right? So then it was on me to kind of speak for those families or elevate their voices. And so I was able to speak directly to the school district and say, hey, we have families who can't participate in grab and go because they don't have a place to store it, but I can store it for them and I can make sure they have access to what they need. And then from there, the school district actually went to other shelters, another family shelter in the community, say, hey, we're doing this over here. Do y'all need this to happen in your shelter also? So I think it really takes kind of like a partnership between everybody, those who are beneficiaries as well as those who, you know, are benevolent in their time and their energy to really to get that out as much as we can until the powers that be, you know, kind of like lift that up.
I can address the question personally and then more broadly. Personally, I grew up, well, I was born in Mexico. My grandparents were farm workers in the central coast of California. That's where I was raised. I was raised on a farm. And despite, you know, those people, you know, picking the food, growing the food, they were the most insecure in Monterey County. And so, yeah, I mean, I just grew up with it and could see it firsthand, but I think a lot of people aren't privy to that. But in terms of the international focus versus the local focus, I went to grad school at an international school because I was intrigued by food insecurity. And of course, you know, as the question was posed, the big topic is international food insecurity. And of course, most of my grad school work ended up focusing on local food insecurity since my school was in Monterey. So it was just very clear to me that we have a very big problem in terms of, I mean, that's an understatement, in terms of food insecurity here. Yeah, that shifted my focus. In terms of how we can get others to recognize it, I think this past year has been a stepping stone. Our food bank, we were lucky to get a lot of news coverage showing families struggling who were struggling before, but who were too ashamed to reach out, quite frankly. You know, I think it's a systemic problem. Obviously, it's going to take a lot to address. But some of the ways we can address is just getting more attention through the media and not casting, you know, food insecurity, hunger, poverty as a personal blight, but rather something that's very, very common and experienced by many people. And just pointing to the fact that people shouldn't be ashamed. It's that we should be addressing it system-wide rather than as an individual.
Yeah, I think you bring up some really good points. Kyra, you mentioned partnership, and Derek, you also mentioned a few pointers as well. I know that you probably all have already covered this, but we have a question from Arlene. Arlene works with Atheist United and the LA Food Bank as well with food distribution. She wants to know what can people do in their own communities, especially for groups that are not really well aware of food insecurity and how it affects families. How can they kind of get started?
I think it starts with finding organizations that are working with these families and working with these children who are food insecure, and really ask how you can help, because what works for us in Columbus, you know, might not work for being in Florida. And so you have to ask people what it is they need. And so some folks might be able to leverage your dollars more than your sweat equity. And that's, I always tell people, like, that's the first place to start, is ask people directly what they need. And that could be, if you know, a community center where there's someone who's working with a particular population, or even if there's a family you encounter in the grocery store and they're asking for something, you know what I mean? Like, it can be that small, and I use small because I don't have another word to describe it right now, but it can be that simple to start there.
I think the whole emphasis on partnerships and collaborations was mentioned, but also, you know, when we were looking at trying to find areas in our county, because our county is it's the size of Rhode Island, so it's a very large county, and it's, you know, you have your urban areas, you have your suburban areas, you have your very rural areas, so it's kind of very mixed. But we have areas that, you know, there just isn't a whole lot out there. And so when we were looking at trying to find these food deserts, we ended up encountering, you know, agencies and nonprofits that were kind of under the radar, providing a lot of these services. And, you know, just trying not to get in that mindset where we're working in silos, you know, just really really creating that network, because, it's kind of cliche, I guess, but, we're stronger together. And that's just kind of that, I think, a mindset, I think we can create cover more ground when we really do collaborate and don't work in silos. I think that really works, that really works well on a community basis, where it's kind of, you're able to build those relationships. And we're able to do that in our county just because it's not too big, it's getting there, but it's still small enough to where we're able to do that. And having partners like United Way and some of the other ones who have, meetings once or twice a month where all the agencies, the continuum of care, all of the agencies get together and try to keep everyone informed. So I think that partnership and collaboration could be a huge component of that.
Yeah, I would just echo what's already been said so eloquently and greatly. And I would just add, in terms of direct support, of course, you can volunteer, donate. With our food bank, we have over 700 partners. So we can put you in those organizations who partner with us, who have less staff. They are probably, run by volunteers. And that's one of the ways where you can see directly the people who are impacted, maybe change the perception you might have about who's experiencing food insecurity, see it firsthand. And then I'd say the next step would be, if you are then impassioned by that, hopefully you can get on board with some public campaigns, putting my advocacy hat on now. There's a lot of ways to just support bills that are out right now. Here in California, we had a large campaign to call the governor to get the universal school meals in the budget. It wasn't going to be included originally, but because there was a public outpouring, it was. So get involved in any advocacy you feel you can handle, because I know it can be a lot. But even an email to the governor or your local council member, city council member, county board supervisor, any action can help move the wheel and get more attention on childhood food insecurity, since, as was mentioned, it's not on everyone's radar.
I have a question from Sarah, and she wants to know what are some of the ways that chronic food insecurity as a child has lasting impacts beyond childhood.
Since my official title has research in the name as well, I could speak a little on this. There's a lot of research out showing just how childhood food insecurity leads to poor, educational outcomes, which of course then perpetuates into, the future in terms of job outcomes and everything else. And then the other, the not the bigger, but probably what is more evident, because, you can literally see it more, is just chronic health conditions, of course, diabetes, hypertension. If you have not enough disposable income to, purchase the food you want, you are likely purchasing the most calorie dense, sugary, carbohydrated food that isn't necessarily the best for a child's developing system. So, and a child's diet will then carry long-term implications into their future. So, the more we can address nutrition now, you have so many negative outcomes you can prevent in the future.
Thanks, Derek, for just covering that and kind of informing us a little bit more about the lasting effects. Something you mentioned, and I wanted to touch upon it. Kyra also mentioned the type of food that people have access to. Kyra, you earlier today spoke about how homelessness can have an impact upon what kind of food we are able to give to kids experiencing food insecurity simply because there's no refrigerators. And then Derek, you also kind of touched upon the nutritious aspect of that causing diabetes later on. What are ways that we can kind of address that and make long-term, more sustainable solutions rather than simply feeding children?
I'm gonna think that in addition to addressing like the in the moment need, also having those education pieces for kids, talking about, what you're eating, why why this thing was chosen for you. Because quite frankly, the children that we encounter specifically in shelter are, and really kids, around the country, you're at the mercy of your parents, right? You move on their schedule, you do what they do, you eat when they eat, right? And you most likely will eat what they eat. And so when you see, if your parent is making, I don't want to call it a poor choice, but when a parent makes a choice that might not be ideal, then that is just your normal, that becomes your choice as well, right? So I think that in addition to having these meals and sharing what we know about health, about nutrition, that we really make it give it to kids in small bites, right? How can they translate this to, when they're going to the corner store to get something, or when they're in the grocery store with their parent, what type of choice they can make? And I think that also will contribute to, how they might interact with food in the future, because food insecure kids they most likely will become food insecure adults. And right, like how do we stop that? And so, I mean, I've seen in the chat, like, what are the common assumptions? And so I think people assume that kids like Takis, they like hot Cheetos, they like candy. And I don't think that they particularly like it. I think it's what they see. And so that's what they eat.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Nudges, is a term used now in terms of getting kids and adults to eat healthier, by small changes and small, like the term implies, nudges towards healthier food options. But addressing the first part of the question in terms of unhoused families and children, how are they going to store the food that we might be giving out at a food distribution if they are in their car or out on the street? Here in LA County, we have one of the highest rates of homelessness, and it's a growing problem. And we have the eviction moratorium, but it's likely that some people are going to fall through the cracks, and some already have, and it's that much harder to then get those people fed because of all the issues we've just stated. So when talking about food insecurity in general, one of the it's again systemic issue. So we need to talk about housing. We need to talk about fair wages, and we can't get childhood food insecurity under control until we get food insecurity in general under control, and make sure that parents, caretakers have the resources to take care of their children in the way that is best fit.
I think Derek just alluded to something that is extremely important. That is, one of the things we do, my program, we go to schools and community events and do what's called a poverty simulation, just kind of bring awareness and sensitivity to people who may just not really understand, what some of these families go to. And one of the things that really comes out of that oftentimes is, we might have school staff say, I never really thought, that the parents of my students are having to make decisions every day on, where they're going to stay. So, the student may not be in school because the parents, when they have a list of priorities, the housing is probably going to be like trying to figure out where they're going to stay, but also food falls in there too. So having a roof over their head or worrying about what's for dinner, a lot of times they're going to worry about, where they're going to lay down at night rather than the food. And so, and then the other big component too, that was brought up is, a lot of our families who don't have, even if they get food, where are they going to cook it? Where are they going to prepare it? Where are they going to store it if it's perishable? We're finding that a lot of budget motels around here are charging extra money for microwaves. So we've started giving out microwaves and crock pots to kind of help with that. But there are so many other underlying issues that I think, if addressed, could certainly help with what's going on. And Derek alluded to fair wages, and you know, in our county, it's a very desirable place to be moving to, apparently, and the cost of you know, to rent and the cost to, you know, to buy a house is going up. So therefore, the people who are already here, who are low income, under income, it's forcing them out. There's just I mean, there's a lot. It's a very complex issue, as Derek kind of alluded to, and I think if we start addressing some of these other things, it could potentially have a positive impact on this as well.
So Derek, you mentioned that it is very systemic, and we all know that it's all about education and making sure that people are also getting fair wages. For the people who are able to kind of make it out of poverty, or at least get on their feet a little bit, whether they are able to finally find a job that pays enough to afford housing, what is one of the things that you've noticed keeping them from making the right food choices even then? And one of the reasons I ask this is because sometimes when you're living in certain places, there's less fresh food options, and fresh food options are generally more expensive. Then you mentioned food deserts as well. So how can people continue to make healthy choices when they're no longer having someone give them those choices or the healthy food?
Yeah, addressing, you know, Wendy's question, and I think Kyra made this point earlier of, you know, it's not necessarily that children are, you know, all about these, you know, junk food, for lack of a better term, but it's that's what's available. That's the corner store. That's in the neighborhood. After I lived on that farm, I grew up in Salinas, another town in the Monterey County, which has large food desert portions, including where I lived. And so I know there was a corner store on the street I lived, and that's where you got your food, and most of it was, you know, chips, candy, soda. And, you know, if you're on EBT, SNAP, or CalFresh here, you might not have very much, you know, on there. And those items at that corner store might be the cheapest items compared to, you know, you having to drive 3-5 miles, however far, to then get groceries at a reasonable price. Because when you're in a food desert or a food apartheid, you are, you know, faced with not only less options, but more expensive options as well, which is just absurd. So it's, it's just making sure that we address that here in California. And I don't know if it's statewide, but at least in San Francisco and LA, we have healthy corner store initiatives where, you know, counties offer grants to local stores, local businesses to put in refrigeration to make sure that they offer fresh fruits and vegetables, you know, fresh dairy, fresh protein, and ensuring that you know, it doesn't continue in perpetuity, that there's no food in these areas. It's a huge, you know, point of contention in terms of, you know, some businesses might not want to, but it's an option for those who want it, this, you know, the grant. But we should really just shift towards making it so that every store has that sort of option, if it's, you know, claiming to be a sort of grocery store.
And I would even push a little further to challenge folks who have access to decision makers to really advocate for like small things, right? So in Columbus, there's a community that is historically Black and called Linden, and it is mostly a food desert. And so the Linden Farmers Market became a thing a couple of years ago, and the producers at that market accept SNAP. I forget what they call like their produce bucks, but you know, your food stamps go double as far at the farmers market. But one of the challenges they had was that, you know, in the first few weeks, they weren't getting many people out. And so it really took folks in the community who are not using SNAP, who are not using food stamps, to patronize the market so that the producers will continue to come back to give folks an opportunity to say, oh, here's this thing in my community that I can now, patronize until the powers that be make a decision to plop something down, in my neighborhood. So again, it's about what's available. And even if we are not decision makers, we might be able to influence some things in some ways. And if we have any access or any proximity to decision makers, like, drop that bug in folks' ear that this is what folks need.
Thank you for just getting into that. A lot of this work, it seems to require some advocacy, some pushing on decision makers. I know, Ben, you work a little bit with that, with policy, and Derek, you do as well. Could you both just talk a little bit more about how people can get started? I think a lot of times it is very intimidating to go up to decision maker and say, hey, this is what we need to do. What's the best way to really do that?
I can go. Well, first, I know Sarah in the chat asked the question if I could elaborate more on food apartheid. Basically, it recognizes that food deserts, are one term, but food apartheid recognizes that oftentimes these food deserts happen with communities of color in low-income areas, and it's something that's systemic and purposeful. Grocery stores choose to not open in certain areas because they deem that population not worthy or not deserving or whatever it might be of their product. And we actually saw that here in LA play out. We had a few Ralph's stores close, and they cited the population that was going, not purchasing enough or not giving enough, revenue profit. So it's just acknowledging that it's not something that just happens organically as a desert might. Rather, it's a state-sanctioned, systemic issue that can be addressed, through policy or through different decision-making processes. But it's something that is man-made, and it's not just something that happens out of nowhere. And then shifting to the policy question, how to get started? That's a great question, because it is very intimidating to reach out to elected officials and getting started with advocacy. I'd say the best first step, even right now, we had a few campaigns on it. It might sound like clicktivism, where you're just clicking on things online, and it feels like there's no actual cohesive action that you've done. But Twitter campaigns, they do work if you tag that politician enough. If they see your hashtag trending, it's still reaching out to your elected officials in some capacity, and they take note. They have staffers who monitor their social media. If you call in to their office, you're most likely not going to get a hold of the elected official. It's going to be a staffer who is likely 21 to 25, who just wants you to state what your position is, and that's it. And they're not going to grill you in terms of why you think something or elaborate what your solution might be. They will just note that you have an opinion on an issue, you are advocating for something, and they'll take note, and that's it. So it's intimidating. I'd say the very first step would just seek out research on any subject that you're advocating for, and just getting knowledgeable on the topic, just because there's so much, because it is so complex. There is a lot to unfortunately learn before you can really make the huge next steps of getting in front of the elected official and actually advocating with them. You can take those steps by learning more, reaching out on social media, and then calling their office, talking with a staffer, and then moving on from there.
I don't really have the level of experience that Derek does on the state level, but just on the local community level, whether it comes to homeless education or awareness of the issues that they face and the obstacles that they have. Just I invite myself to as many meetings as I can, and I try not to be too obnoxious about it. But I am very passionate about it. So, but I've also formed relationships with mayors and school board members, and I was in a civic group. I'm the chair of the governance board for the continuum of care for our county. So just trying to be involved, obviously not involved for the sake of being involved, but to build those bridges and form those relationships that you can, use to bring awareness. Schoolhouse, I'm not sure if any of you guys have heard of Schoolhouse Connection, but it's a national organization they're advocates for homeless education. And so we've partnered with them to, they're going to be working with state legislators to bring about policy that's going to help the students that, we serve in the state of Florida. And they also are trying to bring more awareness to some senators. So we have a meeting with Marco Rubio's staff to try to bring awareness to him, to try to increase funding for homeless education. So just it can be, I think Derek mentioned, it can be intimidating. But at the end of the day, just what I try to remind myself is, why am I doing it? Who am I doing it for? And it's, I picture the faces, the kids I helped when I was at the shelter. My current position, I don't really get to see the kiddos as much anymore, but that's all the motivation I need to try to get past that, self-consciousness. But also, I also try to remember too that when it comes to the topic, especially homeless education, most of the people I talk with, I'm the expert explaining things to them. So these people really don't know what we know. And so it's really our job to make them aware of it, because if we don't, then, someone else might not.
And Ben, Wendy has a question. This is specifically for you. She says that you spoke about rural and urban areas in Polk County. Are there differences in how you address those contexts? Are there kind of things that are unique to certain communities in the urban areas and in the more rural areas that you need to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Transportation, fortunately in the more urban areas, which, we're not talking like LA where Derek's from, or maybe even, Columbus, Ohio, but, there's pretty good city transportation in the Lakeland, Winter Haven metropolitan area. But when we go out to the eastern part of our county, closer to Orange County and Osceola, it's more rural, although it is growing. And then of course, the southern part of our county is very rural, a lot of farming, and citrus. So transportation for those folks to get to, because a lot of these rural areas that don't have anything more than a 7-Eleven, they have to go a city over to get to a grocery store. And so there's no public transportation. So that's a huge, barrier that we have with those in our rural areas. When it comes to the urban areas, when it comes to, food insecurity, I think, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not really sure when it comes to, I know that tends to be, although the rural area has that transportation barrier, I feel like there's just as many areas in the urban areas that have trouble accessing food resources for some of the reasons that Derek had mentioned. So I definitely think there's just as many barriers. They're just different kind of barriers, if that makes sense.
And to add to what Ben is saying, I think that we find that in urban areas like Columbus, a lot of these initiatives are like institution-led. There's some organization that's moving this work forward. And I'm from a small rural city in Alabama called Tuskegee, and in those types of places, I see this food insecurity issue led in small groups, right? So it's even more personal. And I think people are more invested when you're in a small rural area. So if there are folks out there who are looking to get active and you're not in an urban city, like don't think that you can't do anything. Like you can have almost a greater impact because sometimes there's some personal connection and there's some connection to the greater good that you want to impact your community. So I think a lot of times, like Ben was saying, sometimes the barriers are similar, but a smidge different. But I would say that, you can make a great impact across the board, wherever you are, and just kind of tailor it to what your folks need.
Yeah, here in LA County, we are quite urban, but we actually have a very large desert area in the northern tip of LA County, the Palmdale, Lancaster high desert region, as well as a huge mountain range in between, where people do live out there. And in terms of Palmdale and Lancaster, there are very high rates of food insecurity, especially because transportation is a huge issue out there. And in terms of that area, we do try to offer more distributions in the areas where there might not be a grocery store or a local place to buy food in general. And we also offer a mobile food pantry, so that that would take place. A distribution might take place at a local church, local school, local library, park, whatever it might be. As long as an organization is there with volunteers to help distribute the food, we can set up there. But we also offer our own mobile food pantry, which is essentially just a truck, our own LA Food Bank staff who then distribute the food in an even more rural area. It might just be a parking lot, or I know recently we did it at Lake Castaic, which is up in the mountains. So, addressing rural, yeah, definitely different. It has more to do with transportation, but Ben mentioned in urban areas, it is an issue as well. We did a survey in 2019 of the people who access our food banks, and it was over 30% who actually walk to our food pantries. And because of COVID, we had to switch to mobile, or rather drive-through distributions. So that actually impacted our service in terms of who can access our food. So there are barriers that you might not expect. A third of people walk to their food pantries here in Los Angeles, despite it being a city of cars and traffic. Yeah, I think despite there being a big difference in terms of what it might look like, there are some barriers that are the same. And then it's even more of an issue when you start talking about public safety, where there might be issues of just being in, going out and walking in a neighborhood. That might dissuade people from accessing food. And so, again, it's a systemic thing where in order to get food to someone, you also have to address all these other things like transportation, housing, income, also safety. So really, when you start peeling away the onion of food insecurity, there's so many layers. So,
since you all spoke about the differences between urban areas and rural areas, and also the similarities between addressing food insecurity there. I think another thing that we also can see is in certain communities, there are certain racial groups that are more likely to face hunger and food insecurity. Kyra, you mentioned Black communities, and Derek, you also mentioned a lot of Mexican or Central American, South American communities as well. One of the things we also notice is there's a difference in terms of the children in these communities where they're not necessarily found in the same places, especially if they're not in school. They might be out in jobs, just trying to work and feed their families. How does that change your perspective in terms of servicing those kind of communities and those kind of children?
It's a great question. I think one of the approaches we have is by really advocating for changes to improve the CalFresh or SNAP program, because that is one way where, working parents who, might not be able to take their child to a local summer meal site could at least, have enough food in their fridge so that if they have a babysitter, if they have a friend, a family member over, there is food for those children, even during times of school closure, or even, during after school times. CalFresh, can do so much in terms of giving people autonomy to be able to purchase the foods that they want, when they want, where they want. They still might face those barriers we've already talked about, but at least they have a little bit more agency to be able to stock their fridge so that they can then, feed their children.
Kyra, you mentioned also that you've worked with some Black communities where children are more likely to face food insecurity. Does that change your approach, given, we know there's so much racism and that plays into the food insecurity aspect as well? Does it change how you advocate for these children, and also just how to provide food for them?
Yes, I think we across the board we try our best to be as flexible as our families need us to be, right? The hardest part, especially in COVID, has been like the changing movements of families who are in shelter, right? We had kids who were not in school. We had families or parents who were not working at the time, or had reduced hours, right? So that really impacted us. I think one of the biggest things we try to do is just to make meal service available. So like during the school year, we knew, like Ben talked about, kids being bused from one school, one side of town to the next because they started school, on the other side of town. We try our best to have meal service or meals available as late as we can for when that last school bus comes to the shelter and drops the last kid off. And we just really are in the community a lot. I think in Columbus, last I checked, about 70% of the folks who access shelter providers are African American. So 70% of the folks who sleep in shelter at night are African American. And that's doesn't count, like, we haven't separated out like moms with kids versus, Black women versus Black, like that's just, across the board. That's the statistic we're working with. And I think it just, we just try to do our best. Like we try to get folks in the community inside our walls to do their best to give back to children and let people see, like, this is not, it's not an anomaly. This happens all the time. It's ever present in our community. And we can just help out our neighbor. I don't know that it changes the advocacy, because I feel like I've always been hardcore for my community. You know what I mean? And so I just see this, we just keep going harder.
Does culture play a part in terms of the food that you're able to offer? I know that, personally, my grandma was receiving assistance, and she is an Asian American. There's certain types of food she wasn't able to cook. And then, also for my mom as a child, how does that play into helping communities by providing them with kind of the foods that they're familiar with? And I guess this question, Derek, since you mentioned the farm hands, you might be able to answer this question.
Yeah, we're a food bank. Most of our food comes through the USDA. So, it's very up to what the USDA is supporting in terms of farmers. So it might not translate to our local communities and the cultures and the habits that they might have and the food they're accustomed to. So yeah, that's why, you know, in terms of our food pantries, the backpack program, we do offer USDA commodity foods. We do try to supplement it with foods that we get donated or that we purchase using donated funds, so that we are meeting, you know, culturally appropriate needs. But that is why I do mention the CalFresh program, only because it's, you know, right now there's so many barriers, and especially, you know, there's just inherent racism built into the program. You know, there's like language barriers. The call I was on earlier about the bill SB 464, there's immigration barriers. There's just so many issues, but it does allow for these culturally appropriate, you know, foods to be bought by the household. So, you know, we can try to meet the needs of our community, and we do the best we can. But, you know, as a food bank, we are very subject to, you know, what we get donated and what we can afford to purchase. And since we have so many different cultures in LA County, we might not be able to reach anyone or everyone. So yeah, that's why we really put a lot of weight behind making the CalFresh program or SNAP more accessible. You know, there's, you know, work requirements that are inherently racist. There's just a lot of issues that, you know, are holding the program back from actually achieving what its mission is. But yeah, that's kind of a weird answer, but I'll go with that.
Something you mentioned is what you can afford to purchase. And I think that flows into, you know, one of the things that Foundation Beyond Belief likes to say is you can feed someone for $2.50. And you can provide them with a meal, you can provide them with some non-perishables. How does that number change when you're talking about more nutritious food and more sustainable food? And also, how can we get people who are very generous donors to kind of understand $2.50 is great, but it doesn't really go far in terms of nutrition?
Yeah, fresh food is expensive, right? Like it's a thing, right? It is way more expensive for me to purchase, you know, fresh corn than it is for me to maybe get, you know, canned corn from somewhere else, right? And I hate that that is that way. And to Derek's point, we at our facilities, like we patronize our local food bank, the Mid Ohio Food Collective. We patronize them, like we're there every week. We're always getting food. And they support the work. And without them, we wouldn't be able to feed as many folks as we do, because what we get from them, you know, really over the course of a fiscal year, you know, equates to hundreds of thousands of dollars of product, you know, that comes from USDA. So again, like I said earlier, I think those who can, those cash donations definitely can be leveraged in different places. When we talk about fresh food and even cultural things, right? I think that's an opportunity, especially at a homeless shelter like we are. There's an opportunity for groups to come in and do something that is culturally relevant, you know, to the folks that are there. And I mean, it can be as simple as, you know, a group goes out and purchases fresh corn and does a corn roast outside, and they invite everybody out, you know, to partake. So I would definitely encourage folks who can give to continue to give. And even if you can't give, you can drop off fresh, you know, produce to your local shelter that's serving families, or, you know, to folks doing a food distribution. Again, granted that they have somewhere to cook this food, right? Absolutely do it, because it is expensive to feed people. It's expensive to feed myself, right? I don't even look at my grocery budget this month. It's expensive. It really is. And we're talking about feeding hundreds of people a day. $2.50 it can go a long way, and $5 can go even further.
Yeah, no, Kara made great points. If you give to a food bank, we can turn $1 into 4 meals. So we just have, in terms of donation, there's more power that we have in terms of being able to purchase in bulk. And then because I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, but we're serving over 900,000 people per month now. Prior to the pandemic, we were serving 300,000 people per month. And the 900,000 translates to about 2 million pounds of food a week. So we are just, sending out literally tons of food, and it's expensive. But yeah, in terms of purchasing power, food banks have just more ability to buy in bulk and then can get food. But in terms of the nutrition, that is something that's always being weighed. Is, well, we have a pallet of whatever it might be. It's super sugary. Do we really want to purchase it just because it's cheaper than the low sugar option? We'll most likely go with the healthier option, because we are trying to address not only food insecurity, but actually nutrition as well.
For, Derek, you mentioned buying in bulk, and Perry, you also mentioned that as well. For Foundation Beyond Belief, we do work with some smaller teams, volunteer teams that do not necessarily buy in bulk. And we are lucky enough to have some very generous donors who do support that work. At the same time, something that you all have mentioned is educating families, educating children, and people who provide the food. Is there a way that we can help to educate our donors as well, in terms of where their funds go, and also to help educate volunteers who are making these purchasing decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we communicate to our volunteers regularly that, when they contribute to us, they are not only just providing a meal, but they're buying the plate that we had to put it in, right? Because of COVID, we went from, cafeteria style dining to, individual to go package, which threw our costs all out of whack, right? Everybody's fiscal year was set, and then COVID said, "Hey girl, how you doing? We're here, we're changing everything," right? And so we really we're just honest with our donors, like, absolutely, your money is helping us feed folks in ways that you probably don't even realize, right? Like, we had to purchase a brown paper bag so that families could put all of their meals in a bag and take it up to their room to eat, because our dining room is closed. And I think just really being honest and speaking to those real things that's happening on the ground with the folks that you're working with has the most impact. 'Cause I don't know that people realize that that's a cost too, right? A cost that we were not expecting, a cost that no one was really expecting. And from going to using, water fountains in the facility to having to purchase bottled water sometimes. That's something that we weren't expecting. And, and how do we make sure that the kids have everything that they need in order to, have their school day? Because we ended up bringing in tutors and turned our dining room into a little classroom. So, how do we make sure that the kids had, all of their food, right? You got served breakfast, and then your breakfast table turned into your desk. I think people really need to know, how those things happen. And again, talking to folks who are making decisions around, how can we support you? What do you need from us? I think that's always helpful. I'm always grateful for someone who asks in advance, so that they can make sure that their donation is really making that big impact that the end user can benefit from.
Yeah, in terms of costs, not only, and I think Kyra mentioned this earlier, in terms of when you are purchasing, healthy foods, fruits and vegetables, it's not only the cost of the food, but then probably the more expensive thing is the storage. For us, we have tons of cold storage that we legally have to, and for good reason, through USDA guidance and policies, that we have to have a certain, cooler space, a certain temperature. We need to have racking. There's a lot of costs that come associated with any food that we receive, really. The distribution, storage and distribution are a huge cost for food banks and for food pantries. And we do receive some funding for that through the USDA, but it's not enough to cover the full costs. And so it is a funny thing where, we get a ton of food from USDA, but then, our food bank, we're lucky we can afford to do the cold storage and the distribution, the trucking, whatever it might be. But a lot of other food banks or food pantries or whatever it might be, they need to figure out how they're going to store that food. And it's expensive. If they lease out a cold storage unit, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. So in terms of in conversation with donors, if we want healthier foods, it's going to be more expensive, and not just because of the food costs. So even if all of our food is donated, we still need additional money because it costs money just to have the food, or send it out.
I think another piece in that is also labor, right? So it's super easy to crack open a can, dump it in a saucepan, warm it up, serve it out, right? But when we're talking about, because I mentioned corn earlier, we're talking about getting corn, washing corn, shucking corn, cooking corn, right? Like that's another layer. So I think folks, it'd be helpful for folks to know that sometimes your donations are going toward employing folks at a livable wage to make food for people who are eventually going to eat it. Like, these things don't happen by osmosis. As much as we would love them to, I would love to just be able to wake up and say 500 people ate today and it was good, we moved on. But it's just not a thing, right? So in addition to overhead, we have to pay people. And quite honestly, in working as a homeless shelter provider, right, we want to make sure that our employees do not become our clients. So, and how do we do that? Like, we got to pay them.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Because that's, another thing of, we're a nonprofit. A lot of people assume it's all volunteers, and that's far from the reality. We do pay the people who work here, and it is a living wage, and so that is expensive, especially here in LA County, where rent is astronomically high. And specifically to this point of wages, we only recently were able to restart. We used to have it before, but we just restarted our nutrition education department, simply because we were able to get a grant that funded that department. Without that donor, without that grant, we wouldn't have been able to. So literally, they are funding the salary and then the actual education in the community, and it's very powerful.
Thank you so much, Derek and Kyra. Ben, I'd love to hear from you about how we can kind of let donors know and educate them on how they can help and where their money goes.
Well, just speaking, specific to, what I do for my program, we're very lucky to have the community support that we do. It seems like anytime we are running low on someone, out of the blue calls and says, hey, you need help with anything. And then as a matter of fact, we do. But, part of that is kind of what I mentioned before, just getting out in the community. I set a goal every year for myself to present to as many folks as possible in the community. And, with COVID, that did have an effect, but I think once everyone started realizing, things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, it started to pick up again. But, the best thing that I've been able to do, because I will go to, we'll say, a civic group and do a presentation. Someone in that civic group has a committee, and they, raise money to help local things, and they hear about it, and then they email me and say, hey, I heard you at the presentation you did. Can you come and speak to our group? And then there's someone in that group. So, you just don't know the impact you're going to have unless you get out there and present. There's I don't care if the person who wants me to come, it's him and 3 other people, or her or 3 other people. Like, I will go present to absolutely anyone. And as a result of my predecessor doing that, and as a result of, kind of continuing those efforts, I truly believe that's a big part of why we've been able to, receive some of the grants we've received and in-kind donations. We use donated funds to fund a part-time position, to fund 2 vans that help provide supplemental transportation for kids who are waiting on those school of origin bus routes that I mentioned, to buying, helping, we have this group of ladies at a 55 and up community that have raised over $10,000 for our program in the past 2.5 years through bake sales. So, these are things that would never have happened unless we got our boots on the ground and went out and spoke, because they invited us and we went out and spoke. And so you just never know where the support is going to come from unless you get out there. And, trying to get in the paper once in a while doesn't help either. It doesn't hurt either. We just had an article about our program a couple weeks ago and have received a lot of support from that. So, presentations, media, just walking down the street with a loudspeaker, if you have to.
Claire doesn't have a question, but she mentioned that she wants people to, I'll just read her comment. She says, I think people want nonprofits to earn their work hard for the glory of it. Being well paid is frowned upon. There's a good TED talk on this about reframing how we think about nonprofits. And she did drop that TED talk link into the chat. Thank you for that, Claire. I think that's a great talk that I've actually watched as well. And I feel like people should definitely take a look at it if they have a chance. If there's no more questions, I wanted to give you all a chance to kind of drop your last thoughts and to thank you all so much for just joining us and speaking about your work as well.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for having me. And we appreciate at Shelter Services, we appreciate our groups like Count that come in and are dependable. At this point, our guys know how to work around the kitchen. They come in, they know their tasks, they get it done. And we just appreciate the local folks who are giving of their time and giving of their efforts. If you want to support the work that we do at the Y in Columbus, you can go to ymcacolumbus.org/giveherhope. That's our campaign that we do. And there we're providing rental assistance to folks who are moving out of shelter. We, try to get folks furniture, try to fill up their refrigerator, when they move out of shelter, and as well as move forward other programs that we have. So if you'd like to support, that's where you can go do it.
I'm going to encourage everyone, if wherever you are in our country, if you want to know who the person that does what I do in your school district, if you want to learn more about your local homeless education program, my website, or the website for our program, was shared in the chat box earlier. You can find my contact information. In fact, I think I did share my phone number as well. But reach out to me and I can connect you with, I can connect you to the homeless liaison or the homeless education program in your school district, if you want to learn more about what's going on in your community.
And first I wanted to say thank you for the invitation and for the wonderful discussion here. Everyone is really awesome. So it's just a privilege to be here. And I did want to acknowledge Claire's comment. I got my master's in public administration, which focuses on nonprofit management. It's a whole master's degree because it's hard running a nonprofit and it's expensive, and they should get paid. So thank you, Claire. And I'll drop a few links. I put a URL in the chat, but it's just numbers. So I'll say For the question on food insecurity and health outcomes for children, there's a great article from Craig Gunderson and James Ziliak. They both have worked with Feeding America to highlight food insecurity. And so they did a peer review and did some research on outcomes, on health outcomes. So specifically for that question. And since I mentioned them, I'll say feedingamerica.org to get just a sense of food insecurity nationwide. If you want to advocate, frac.org, FRAC.org, Food Research and Action Center. They can help you get started in terms of research and then advocacy. They often have forms you can fill out very easily, just to add your name, and it'll get sent to the appropriate person. And then, of course, if you would like to donate to our food bank, lafoodbank.org/donate. And then, of course, you could visit our website as well to get more information on volunteer opportunities. We always welcome volunteers, either as individuals or groups. And you can either be at our food bank actually packing food, or you could be at a food distribution, a pantry partner, and actually work with people in the community as well. So a lot of opportunities for action. But again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to our panelists for all the hard work that you do with families, with children, and other people who are food insecure. And thank you to our audience. If you want to support any of these organizations, the links are all in the chat box.
Thank you. Good night.